Hi, Tirza. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And it's fun. Just our previous conversation of the full circle of, past lives of all of us, how we've interacted in the past and what everybody's up to now.
Yeah, many lives within one life.
Yeah, lives within lives. So we thought a good way to start with you is actually to hear a little bit about your background and your upbringing. And this show is going to focus quite a bit on intergenerational trauma and some of your work there, and also some other insights you have as a spiritual leader and a rabbi. But we thought it'd be great to just start a little more personal and just say a little bit about, I believe you grew up in an Orthodox family, is that right?
Yes, I did.
Okay, yeah, it would be great to just hear, what was that like for you growing up in an Orthodox family, and maybe just some of the real supportive elements that came out of that for you, and also some of the challenges that you had to work through because of that upbringing.
Great. I'd love to share about it. My upbringing in the Midwest, St. Louis, Missouri, in a very Orthodox, modern Orthodox, but fairly ultra Orthodox community there, was very rich in so many ways, rich in education, both cultural education, Hebraic education, secular education, and of course in a sense of community and belonging, which is so important. When you're in this community, in this traditional Jewish community, and with that kind of upbringing, that you have kin everywhere in the world. You can go anywhere and you'll find a place to stay. You'll have meals. There's sort of like a grid, a worldwide network that you can plug into. But the other side of that coin, of course, is a sense of insularity and living in a kind of closed circuit that goes hand in glove, really, with being in a tribe. That sense of tribe is so positive, and it's also can be pejorative as well. So being a curious lass, as I was, and extremely hungry for spiritual exposure and also spiritual independence, I really needed autonomy. By the time I was a teenager, I made off as soon as I graduated high school and went on my own odyssey to discover the world. And I wanted to get truly as far as I could from my Jewish background and from my family, who I, reckoned were they were so pathetic and so neurotic, and that's the first. And to discover a life, to discover what was out there. So that really is the topic of my first book, which is a memoir, and how I made this odyssey into. I went around the world traveling and did everything from Kundalini yoga to Christian mysticism to got very overly involved in a Hindu cult and to Eureka, to all of these things, and just sated my appetite for all these things, and of course, paradoxically, it led me back home. Led me back as the hero's journey often does, back to where we started from. So it was only much later that I understood that you really can't split from your matrix. Your matrix goes with you. It's so deeply embedded in you, in your nervous system, in your psyche. And so all the neuroses of my family had traveled with me to Boulder, Colorado, which is where I ended up. And once I began studying healing arts and then psychology and started to get my degrees, I realized, oh my God, well, my matrix was really, I was the product of trauma. I was a product of trauma survivors, my parents. So I'm sure that this is both my journey as well as many people listening here. We come full circle, and then we realize I have to start where I began. I have to continue where I began and left off.
That sort of leads into the next question. Thanks for sharing that. And The question is sort of about your interest in intergenerational trauma, and you started to answer where that comes from. But also just so where that interest deeply comes from for you is a part of the question, the next question. And then also about your just hearing a little bit about your own relationship to what you traverse there in terms of inside yourself around recognizing if you've recognized intergenerational trauma and what you learned from that process.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it took me years, really decades, to be able to language these things. Of course, it wasn't as much in the collective consciousness as it is today. Intergenerational trauma wasn't a term, nor was historical trauma or collective trauma or any of these things. I think that that's really been burgeoning over the last really 10 to 15 years. But I realized once I started studying trauma psychology and healing that I was the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. My mother never spoke of it. Of course, she had a German accent. She was escaped Nazi Germany in 1939 on the Kindertransport, this amazing project that was instigated by the Quakers to get get youngsters out of Nazi Europe in time, and so there were thousands of children that were put on trains and taken to freedom. So she narrowly escaped, and her siblings all made it out. Her cousins, uncles, and aunts were all murdered in Europe. She never spoke of that, but I found out much later. And my father was an American kid who was, because he happened to know German, he was a Jewish guy from Brooklyn, was sent in the U.S. Army during the war to all the most devastated portions of Germany to do bomb detection. And so he found himself in the camps upon liberation. And what he saw in Buchenwald, for instance, in 1945, as the British troops were liberating that death camp, was, I think, more than his circuitry could contain. And he was extremely traumatized. But again, he never mentioned that. In fact, I never knew about that part of him until I read his obituary, literally, that my brother had put together. I was already in my late 20s. I did not know that he was there. But later we liberated his file cabinet and found this stack of photographs that he had taken there while he was serving in this death camp. And I realized all the dots just connected for me, and I realized, oh my God, that's what was making him tick all those years, and that's what that's what was feeding inside of her. And they never mentioned these things. They were kept secret to probably to spare us, as trauma often is. We try to spare ourselves. We try to spare others the residue, the horror, the shock, the grief. But it doesn't work because we have these nervous systems, and so it comes out sideways. And it came out in their parenting, and came out in their politics, and it came out in every which way. And so we received it. We received the transmission. For me, every one of my siblings handled it in a different way. Some not so well. There's a lot of suicide and mental illness in my family. For me, I went into psychology and started to research and started to study and started to work on myself in Jungian analysis. And so the rest is history.
Thanks for that, Tirzah. So many different directions we could go with this conversation right now.
Yeah.
I'm thinking just about the parallels of, the experience I've had in my family and growing up in the South in a Methodist family that didn't talk about emotions much. And the I just thought was curious how many suicides and how many, very mentally ill people were in my family tree. And it took a lot for me I I think in my 40s, before I started to appreciate the level of trauma that I was carrying in my own body. Part of which was definitely, coming through the lineage. It's amazing how many decades can pass before someone speaks up.
Sometimes it's entire generations.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that those secrets don't land in us and they
Right.
push at us and they really work us over.
Absolutely. I mean, from the inside out, right? And I'm curious with your background as a spiritual leader, as a rabbi, and as a Jungian psychotherapist. Did I say that the right way?
Yeah.
How would you position spirituality as a part of the healing process with trauma?
It's everything. It's the beginning. Wherever I start when I teach, I'm working with that common boundary between spirituality and the psyche. Well, the psyche. What does psyche mean? It means soul. And so we're those of us who are in healing arts, and I say that as a broad envelope. We're soul doctors. We're the new incarnation of priests and priestesses. I think in many regards, people have dropped out of synagogue life or out of church life, or maybe they go, but they want to dive more deeply than their clergy can take them into the psyche, into the land of dreams, into the land of these deep urgings and promptings of the soul. So, in my work, I talk a lot about this common boundary of, I like the word entelechy. It's a word that Jean Houston introduced me to. It's a word that's in the English language, but it's rarely used. It comes from the word telos, which means an end goal or an aim, and entelechy is the internal end goal, the internal sort of the soul's code that is imprinted upon us at birth, we could say, or even before birth, that pushes upon us or prompts or urges us toward our work. There's a lot of talk about the daemon, about the higher calling in Jungian psychology, and Hillman wrote that famous book, The Soul's Code. And in mysticism as well, we find that certainly in Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, there is a sense that we've made a contract. Our soul has made a contract. We've signed up for a piece of work to do here. In Judaism, we call it the tikkun, our tikkun, the piece of repair work that we and only we can affect in this life. And that's based upon our everything from genetics to family traumas to our metabolic forces to our, what our nervous system can handle or not, or it's everything. It's all of those factors included, and what are perhaps past incarnations as well, what we are here to do. So although I tried desperately to flee my heritage, I mean, desperately, and married a Christian minister who, I thought that I was safe. My whole family disowned me. I was excommunicated for years, and I thought, at some deep level, I thought, phew, I'm free. I've made it home. I'm free. They can't get me now, because they hated the idea that I had married a Christian, a devout Christian. But this Christian minister ultimately was someone who had studied with Abraham Joshua Heschel and Maurice Friedman, and he knew all about Kabbalah, and so he was asking me, like, why don't you love your heritage? Like, what's wrong with you? Like, I know more about your Judaism than you do. You need to check it out. And so there I was, and through that new more free lens, I was able come back and revisit my heritage. It was all a trick. It was all a grand cosmic trick to get me back in the fold and to become re-engaged with my birth religion and get back into it, but at a much deeper level, at a level that really has transformative power and healing power. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, but there is this common boundary between spirituality and psychology. Of course, I'm talking about depth psychology, and that's always been my avenue.
Thanks, Tirza. So that's it. I want to kind of open up a little dialogue here about the concept of intergenerational trauma and share a short story with you to lead into that. So, and we discussed this a little before the call, but so probably 12 years ago, probably someone Annie Brooke. You know Annie Brooke, Tirza? Yeah. So Annie was the first person that said to me, I wasn't well mentally, and she said to me, I think this is something about the Holocaust. She was the first person that ever said that to me. And I was like, how? I don't know. I mean, it just felt so far off in the moment. But over time, within a couple of years, I realized that there was a major wound there inside of my psyche, my soul. And eventually I went on a journey out to the camps by myself. And the first place I went, you just mentioned, was Buchenwald. Do you say Buchenwald? That's how you pronounce it, right? Yeah. So it was my first stop. And when I got there, it happened to be a day where when I got up to the gates, the fog was so thick you couldn't see past the gates. It was like, maybe 5 feet in front that you could see. So it automatically started stirring up experiences of feeling something I had always felt inside of me, which is I'm terrified of what's in front of me, but I don't exactly know what's coming. I sort of, it was like sort of like the mystery in front of me doesn't feel good. And just not being able to see, and it was stirring up all these old memories. And then I went inside, and once all the fog cleared, I was walking around, and all I could think about was how would I try and escape from here? For hours, I was just kept going there, and then I realized there is no escaping from here. And I came to that in myself. There's no way to get out of here. And then, so I'm sharing this because what came out of that for me was recognizing a lot of the way I was thinking in my life based on these sort of patterns of like, how would I get out of here? I can't do anything about it. Now I just feel like I'm going to give up. And I'm just curious for you about, you've been looking into intergenerational trauma for a long time. Just how much do you think this impacts people? Obviously, not just the Holocaust. There's so many traumas across generations and across groups of people. And how much do you think this is impacting people in the way they operate in the world and who they are? And do they just have no clue that's going on? I mean, I had no clue that was going on until about 12 years ago.
Absolutely. It's fascinating to learn people's stories and the kinds of themes that we, from the time we're children, grow up with, a feeling of being suffocated, or a feeling of having to hide, a feeling of contempt, a sense of self-hatred, whatever it is, that those threads that we have, that we work them, we own them, we try to go to therapy to undo them. And from this larger perspective, we begin to realize that these things didn't always begin with us, that as we do this ancestral excavation through our dreams and through our journeys, like you did, going to actually making a geographical journey, we understand that people in our family system, not only did they have those same feelings, but they were living them out. I just worked with a woman who was always ducking and hiding and trying to be invisible. And when she opened that up and and opened up the possibility that there was more to this, and did some ancestral work, she learned that her forebears were living in hiding, and that this was a kind of imprint, epigenetic imprint, that we don't really understand completely scientifically yet. There's not enough data in, but we know enough intuitively to know that we are part of a morphogenic field that is our family, and that these unfinished threads, the unfinished life stories and the unmetabolized traumas go somewhere. They don't just end when our lives end. They do get passed through the family train, and they continue in the next generations. So I've heard unbelievable stories of impossible kinds of transmissions that you just literally can't imagine how this transferred from 2 generations hence, but they do. And maybe we'll tell some stories too before we're done.
Sounds great. I would love to hear some more stories of intergenerational transmission. And, right now is such a difficult moment in the world, and there's so much going on. We have, the backdrop of the environmental crisis. We have political unrest with a, very contentious election coming up. We've got heightened awareness of racial inequality, with the murders of people of color the past few months. And of course, we've got the pandemic on top of it all. And I'm wondering if you could speak to a mental or, psychological, spiritual framework for how to make sense of the world right now, how to cope with these challenges.
Yeah, through the lens of intergenerational trauma, it's everywhere. This is a very fraught time. It is a very dark time, and I think we are all feeling that deeply. And I would say here that what we're experiencing in the world today is, in so many regards, the product of centuries and generations of intergenerational trauma that's forcing its way to the surface to be healed. Now, that is both very dark, and it's also very promising if we can rise to the occasion. When we think about the racial violence and the racial upheaval, for instance, just for one instance, generations of hate crimes, of violence that came long before George Floyd, centuries of such things which were not caught on camera, which were living in the blood, in the life stream of Black people and people of color all over the world. You saw what happened. It spread out from this country and became viral within a day or two. There were protests all over the world against it because the pain is intergenerational, because the tolerance of this has come to a boiling point. You think about it's so many, think of the kind of ethnic violence and genocide and intergenerational trauma that predated the state of Israel. Okay, and then you look at the policies today in the state of Israel, which is also a very contentious area in the world, but it's gotten much less view time because of everything else, annexing the Palestinian territories. So you take that in the context of the larger matrix of the historical traumas. Think about the wounds of the patriarchy, the massive intergenerational injuries that women have endured for centuries. We can barely even speak about that. Everything from the witch burnings and the kinds of horrors that women have lived through that predated the women's movement and the Me Too movement, and the sense of enough. And frankly, the movement away from cisgender binaries might also be part of that patriarchal trauma that we have all been bearing and tolerating for too long. So it's everywhere, and if we can look at these things through the broadened aperture, the wider perspective of intergenerational history, we might have a little bit more compassion for the fact that these things are, it's like all of these things are coming to a head now. And so it's an opportunity. It's such an opportunity. It's such a crisis moment that if we seize it, if we can see it and grip it from that place of compassion and that we have the power to transform these things and we must seize them, then it can be a profound turning point. So much more to say there, but just a little piece of my vantage point.
Yeah, and it seems like your work, a lot of your work is about developing ways in which people can heal from these generations of archives inside of them of the pain of the past. And I'm just curious about your perspective on how much is it important that individuals are healing this inside themselves in order for us to also collectively make changes in the world.
Yeah, there's such a paradox about there, isn't it? I mean, we want to grip all of these enormous collective themes, but we can really only start from ourselves. So one of my philosophy professors taught years and years ago that these universal themes can only be gripped by the particulars. But once we understand that, we're looking at the hallmarks of trauma, and one of the most mysterious ones, we know about hyperarousal, we know about shame and isolation, but one of the most mysterious ones, and I write about it in my book, Wounds into Wisdom, is the one which is the hallmark of trauma that's about its repetitive nature. And of course, Freud called it the repetition compulsion. And it's this unconscious compulsion to reenact the injury on ourselves or on others. And, we see this both very much inside. If I'm a victim or a survivor of sexual abuse or sexual assault, there is this compulsion to master that and to keep, but I'm more vulnerable to abuse for that reason. And this also happens on a large scale perspective, how whole ethnicities keep repeating and reenacting historical trauma. So it finally comes down to this aha recognition. If I can recognize, the pattern, if I can recognize that pattern in myself, then I can bring it to my prefrontal cortex. I can get it out of my limbic brain that is sort of like a mechanically reenacting, and I can start to grip it in myself. In my work, in my teaching, I'm hopefully helping people to sort of pull the threads in their own personality or their behaviors or their stuck places and follow the thread into larger contexts, into the family, culture, or tribe, so that they can start working on it. But first, it does have to start, I think it has to start in ourselves. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I think that it's sort of a both end for me. In myself, in ourselves, that has to be happening while the work's also happening externally in the environment on the social level. But it seems like the problem is if we focus too much on the outer environment and making change there, and we're still traumatized, we're going to keep getting ourselves into trouble throughout our lifetime.
Yeah, and you see this in the world of activism. You know, when we're doing our activism, when we're doing our tikkun olam work, we call it our repair work, our service in the world, and we are ourselves are still hyper aroused, and we're coming from a reactionary place, and like a hyper vigilant place, or the bombs are going off in my body. It's pretty rare that I'm going to be able to interface in a civil, compassionate way with people that are toting guns or people that are saying things to me. I found it even on the hiking trail in Colorado this summer, where scores of people coming in from Texas are not, and they refuse to wear masks. It's like, and getting into it, like, I have to do my own work first. Otherwise, I'm going to be completely ineffective
Right.
with others. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, how are you defining trauma at this point? I mean, there's so many different lenses on how we could speak about trauma. We could talk about it from a neurological perspective. We could talk about it from a psychological perspective. We could talk about it from an external perspective of these types of events are traumatic. Like, I'm just curious how you're defining trauma now,
Yeah.
with everything you study.
So simply, my friend Resmaa Menakem, or Menachem, is sometimes said, he's a Black activist and trauma therapist from Minnesota, from the Milwaukee area. He says, any life experience that comes at us too fast, too much, too soon, it's really any life experience that is too extreme to digest, to process, to integrate at the moment. And so we go into this life-saving mechanism, the self-defense mechanism that preserves it rather than shatters us. It puts it aside. So we immediately send it elsewhere. So we dissociate so that we can keep functioning. And I think dissociation is probably the number one hallmark of trauma, whether we're talking about individual or collective trauma. Is we numb out, and we let the memory fragments splinter in our psyche, and ultimately we have to reintegrate those memory shards. I think it's the kinds of hallmarks that we see for individual trauma, for these overwhelming, unmetabolized life experiences, is the same as for collective trauma. The whole ethnicities can be numbed out, can be dissociated. Whole ethnicities are, I know from being a Jew, we're in constant hyperarousal. I think that comes from living for centuries with waiting for the shoe to drop, waiting for the expulsion, waiting for the next pogrom or for the next raid. So that is deeply embedded in our gene system and and epigenetically as well. So yes, micro, macro, same. There's a sameness.
Sameness, yeah.
Yeah.
We've we've had a number of guests on the show here who we had Dick Schwartz, who brought forward internal family systems, parts work, and had Peter Levine and Gabor Mate, and different perspectives on or different approaches to the process of healing trauma. And from your background as a Jungian psychotherapist, how would you describe how the Jungian framework can help with trauma? What have you seen there?
Yeah, that's so good. I don't think of it in terms of Jungian or it's all a gestalt at this point from Bessel. There's like a spectrum, but I've always been. I'll start here. That I've always been a dreamer. And from the time I was 8, I began to keep journals because I just felt that was sort of my God voice speaking to me. And of course, I went into Jungian study as early as I could. So there's a sense of this interior self that is whole, this hidden wholeness that Parker Palmer speaks about, this sense of unshatterable wholeness of the soul that is a starting point for the trauma work that I feel is very, very powerful and very positive in the Jungian work, that we're always referring back to that potential self, capital S self, and that sense of telos, that sense of I am here because I have something to uncover, I have something to free, I have something to heal, and that is my life. That is my life's work, and so the Jungian work makes available these larger themes, the archetypal themes, that is beyond tribe, it's beyond culture, it's the themes of humankind, death and life, mother and father. It also, I would say now, and because we're talking on this day in this summer in this strange, surreal reality with so much at stake, I would say that Jung was one of my teachers, and in his the big trajectory that came forth from his work in Jungian psychology, in archetypal psychology, we're unafraid to say that evil is emerging. To use that word, evil, with a capital E, even, to say that the darkness that we're feeling, no, it's not just the absence of good. We're saying that there are dark forces that have been unleashed, and that we are in a moment right now in world history that we have to, it's not the only moment, certainly it's not unprecedented, but that we have to understand that everything is not relative. No, actually it's not. That there are good people on both sides. No, actually we need to understand that evil forces have been unleashed. Now, some of your listeners, I'm sure, will think I'm out of my mind, I'm archaic, but we see that in watching dreams now, many dreams that are being dreamt by people from different cultures, we see that I've seen it in dreams that say we're enslaved, or that there's a global strike, or I've seen all kinds of symbolisms for this darkness, but that we have a big God wrestling going on here. We have a big wrestling match, and it's not short thereof to say that we're trying to wrest out the forces of light. I know that might sound very Gnostic or very dualistic, but that's what I love about the Jungian work. It's so simple and yet so complex at the same time. But Jung would say that the archetypal forces have been unleashed now, and that it's very important that we do not go with the masses, that we don't get caught in the group mind, the mass mindedness, he would call it, but that we keep our own thread, the thread of our soul, and that we are listening to our own interior voice as best we can right now, to be the individuals that we are. And there's the paradox, that as we listen to our soul's voice, we're part of the anima mundi, the soul of the world as well, because she's crying out. She's crying through us, through each of our individual souls.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And it reminds me of the this word that's come up a few times today is telos or telos. It's something that Keith and I study with a teacher named John DiMartini, who connects the word telos with the telencephalon, which is the front part of the brain. And when you start talking about evil, I start thinking about how distortions from trauma and what we're talking about today, undigested intergenerational trauma, can they actually wire the brain into more of a limbic pattern where we're just reacting and we see things in black and white terms and friend or foe, very binary perspective. And so I'm wondering about, what do we do about this on the bigger level of getting people into their telencephalons and supporting them to follow their existential healing, their tikkun, to borrow that word. How can we mobilize large numbers of people right now into this expression of their own telos?
Yes, it has to be, it's so urgent that it has to be large scale and fast. And yet that's also reminds us that we have to go as slowly as possible so that we stay embodied. There's all kinds of paradoxes here. We have to stay embodied and take our bodies along on the journey and listen deeply inside and have enormous compassion for being in bodies and having and trying to digest all that's, just to digest, it's a traumatic experience just to read the New York Times every day, the amount of suffering that's going on. When you say telencephalon, I'm wondering how does that interface with the prefrontal cortex? Well,
basically the same structure. Okay. So where executive functioning occurs, abstract thinking,
okay.
Impulse inhibition,
Yeah.
things that are important for functioning as a healthy adult.
Yes, yeah. Good. So we're on the same page.
Yeah,
I was just checking there, and I have so much reverence for all the people who are doing trainings and in compassion, in mindfulness, in every form, because that really is exercising and cultivating that part of the brain, and then it's being tested, obviously, right now with so much heat and reactionary turbulence in the air, in the field. I'd love to hear, and let's talk a little bit about your work, because that's something that I have my eye on, and if that's okay, how you would answer that question, given your cutting edge work.
I suffer from a compulsion to go too fast, so I'm always asking, how can we do this faster? And I really appreciated what you said about there's this paradox, right, of digestion of our experience actually takes the amount of time that it takes. So thank you for that reminder. I think the approach that Keith and I have taken with our institute is to really, and we're doing it right now with you, is to deliver wisdom from people like you to people who are hungry to learn about the root causes of these massive problems that we're facing as a species, and as a culture, and as individuals, and what can we do about it? So spreading awareness and giving people an opportunity to contemplate mindfulness practice, or going for some trauma therapy, or looking up the Jungian therapist in the neighborhood, or finding your book and reading that, or looking at Rachel Yehuda's perspectives. And so that's, I think, the best that I can offer is to do as much as I can to spread the word.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I do believe that as each of us, and I'm talking to you and Keith and everyone who's listening, as we do our work, our personal work, and keep deepening it and expanding it to in larger context to understand the matrix of our issues, we are really putting forth ripples of inexplicable change that can go into the collective. I really do believe in Rupert Sheldrake's understanding of that morphogenic field, that we are all interconnected in this web work. And as those of us who are doing our work make our breakthroughs, we are shifting the larger field. And I see this with ancestral healing all the time, where a student or one of us has a breakthrough toward compassion and honoring some not in our family field. And then, within a week, there's a letter from somebody who knows nothing about us, has been, in completely someone who has been shunned or who has shunned us. All of a sudden, a letter comes, or the phone will ring, and there they are. Like, I just had this feeling I wanted to call you. I just had this. So there are these mysterious, magical repercussions that happen when we do our work, and we can't do other people's work, but certainly can't do our children's work for them. But our work benefits the next generations as well. I truly believe that.
It's a very rich conversation. I think it would be good to get a story from you before we end. Maybe a story of healing, or
a story of
healing. Let's get a story of healing.
Here's a story that I tell, and Wounds into Wisdom is full. It's all it is stories. It's my doctoral work that went around looking for people around the world who had suffered enormous tragedies, unspeakable tragedies, and yet had made it through into becoming brilliant, transformed moral leaders and teachers in the world. And so it's a book full of stories like that. So here's a story of a woman who came to me. Her lineage was Iranian. Her parents had made it out of Tehran on they were very wealthy people, but they closed up their mansion with a shopping bag of nothing else and rode out on a donkey cart riding on opium bundles in the middle of the night. This is in the early 1980s. At the onset of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, striking down on all minorities. Anyway, this client who came to me was in utero at the time when her mother rode out with their parents on this donkey cart across the Pakistani border, and then bribing people left and right, and finally coming to Switzerland, and then finally coming to Miami, and etc. So it was a great family legend, and she was very proud of it. But she had a very big problem in her family, which was that her 7-year-old daughter was very dysfunctional, a paralyzed child, not physically, but she had this horrible, outsized separation anxiety situation, and couldn't go to school and couldn't have play dates, and she could not let go of her parents. She couldn't let them be out of sight. And so my client was pulling her hair out and came to me for just some support. And I just, for a fluke, I said, let's diagram your family story let's diagram your family on a genogram. Let's make a family tree. And as we did that, and she told her family legend, and she was so proud of it, I said, but what about this other side of the family? I hear nothing about that. And she went home that night and started to ask questions, and all hell broke loose because she unearthed a family secret, which was very filled with shame, which was that her parents, when they rode out of Tehran, they left a 94-year-old blind grandmother, completely cogent. She wasn't in any way mentally compromised, but she couldn't see, and she was very vociferous, and they didn't want to tell her that they were leaving for fear of their lives, that she might set off alarms. And they simply closed the door on her. They never said goodbye. And here she had a grandchild. Her first grandchild was being brought into the world. They never said goodbye. They just left. And she died shortly thereafter, after, talk about separation anxiety and a broken heart. They never said goodbye, and they never contacted her after that. And they just, this was a horrible secret. And as my client, Esty, started to unearth this and rant and rave at her parents for having done such a heinous thing, and a lot of grief and a lot of, there was a memorial service, and pictures started to get pulled out, and stories, and a lot of the shame and the secret nature of this was released. It took weeks of hell, basically, and tumult. In the other part of the house, this little 7-year-old girl started to heal. And within 3 weeks' time, she was back in school. she started saying, "Get me out of here! All you adults are crazy. Whatever's going on." She had no idea what was going on, but she wanted out, and she started going back to school and going back to seeing friends. She became this normal 7-year-old girl again. So we see that there, over generations and thousands of miles, these things can be transferred. These terrible wounds can be transferred through generations. And a separation anxiety, a heartbreak around separation can land in 2 generations hence. And with the mourning and with the unloading of that secret, that family secret, unloading of the heart and doing the grief work, which is so important, we release things. We release a magic. We release vitality. We release healing power that we don't even know the extent of its ripple. And so that's one story to take with you.
It's a great story of transformation, and I'm glad you shared that one. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
So what would you like? I would love to hear, what books should people be aware of that you've written, ways of working with you, or ways to be in contact with you. What would you want people to know?
You can be in contact with me through my website, tirzahfirestone.com. Very, very simple. There's an info button there. And there you'll see my what I'm teaching. Of course, everything is online now due to COVID-19. But hopefully I'll be teaching again, doing ancestral healing in person, God willing, at some point, maybe in the next year or years. And Wounds into Wisdom is my book. It's a book about intergenerational trauma, and it's a book about stories from all over the world like this. It's a book about what trauma is made of in lay terms. It's an easy to read and very capturing, and also filled with stories and hope that we can integrate our trauma in a way that is both for the life of ourselves, our families, and also for this world that we love so much.
Great. And we end the same way with everyone, which is you had a billboard that every human would see once in their lifetime, and it had a paragraph on there. What message would you tell everybody on this planet?
You are far more powerful than you know. And as you go inside yourself to follow your heartbreak and to follow your inner promptings, you will unleash those powers to help so many people around you.
Thank you for these words of hope. There's a time when we all need that. Thank you very much. It's wonderful having you.
Yeah, it's wonderful for me too.